This is from Ziggy's channel. It's her Fred Hill conversation. It is no commentary, interview only, no commentary, June 17th, 2022, with Fred Hill. That's the name of the video. And this is Summer Moon Utah Wells. She is likely 3.5 feet tall and around 40 pounds. She has blonde hair and blue eyes. She was 5 at the time of her disappearance, to turn 7 February 4th. Around 6:30 p.m. on June 15th, 2021, 911 was called by Summer's parents to report Summer missing out of the Beech Creek community of Hawkins County, Tennessee. Summer allegedly went missing from outside her home. Summer's head was shaved at the time of her disappearance, and she could have easily been mistaken for a boy. If you have any information on Summer's whereabouts, you are urged to call 1-800-TBI FIND and with all credible tips. Fred and Ziggy's conversation, titled Interview Only, No Commentary, Fred Hill, June 17th, 2022, Part 3, was hard for me to understand, and I thought the whole thing was so interesting, so I'm reading it. For those that may want to hear it with fresh ears and wanted a short summary of what Fred was saying throughout the interview, this would be helpful, hopefully. It starts off with Ziggy. She says, "Marlena will not talk to me." "Marlena was told not to talk to anybody," says Fred. "Marlena should hold some pretty valuable evidence because her daughter and her were staying down there at the Wellses." "Okay, so they did talk to her though," Ziggy says, and Fred says, "Yeah, so they did talk to Marlena and she was told not to talk, apparently." Marlena's dad is the one that Don had told all the stuff to, that he sacrificed Summer to do away with all their major sins. Ziggy says she's going to be freaked out if there's some kind of connection with the church because she went there and they seemed like normal people, says Ziggy. Fred says a lot of the time they do seem like normal people because they don't want to be exposed. Don was talking about how the Romans were the richest people in the world and how they would do away with kids and stuff. Fred says it's like Don was trying to beat around the bush and tell him what happened without really saying it. They didn't ever have remorse, neither one of them, says Fred. Don may have been there 10 times before Summer came up missing, but the week Summer went missing, he couldn't get rid of Don, he says. He had been there 100 times the week Summer went missing. All Don would want to talk about is religion, about them gaining power by taking kids and doing away with them so they can keep the power or something, more or less, to gain more power, to be like a king, says Fred. Fred also says it didn't make any sense to him, but that's what Don said. Fred says Don was trying to get him to read some book. Ziggy said yes, he tried to get her to read that book too, by Ellen G. White. Fred says the way he took it was if he could get that book and read it, that would be the story of what happened to Summer. If someone could get the book he's got, it may have other stuff written in it somewhere, but if they could get that book and really look into it, maybe they could figure something out. Fred says the only time Candace got religious is when she thought she was going to jail. Ziggy says Candace doesn't seem religious. Ziggy asks Fred, "Do you think Candace would agree to something like that, though, sacrificing Summer?" Fred says she will do whatever Don says. Candace acted like those kids weren't nothing to her, Fred says. Ziggy asks if the kids would ever stay over there at their house by themselves, and Fred says, yeah, he saw them over there by themselves a lot. The boys were probably 2 and 4, says Fred. It was just the 2 boys at the time. They had a tree fall down next to Fred's mom and dad's property, and they took it and dragged it up the road, and he took it and dragged it off for them. And something happened, and the tree ended up by the Wells property, okay? When he went down there to haul it off, he says from where they dragged it to, you could see into the basement door of the Wells. He said the 2 young ones were locked in there, and the 2 boys didn't have any clothes on. They were just 2 mattresses on the floor. There wasn't any stairs going up to the top. It was just the basement. You could see right in. Fred says he was scared to death of somebody knocking on the door, somebody that never even met them. Don was at work that day. Candace never would come to the door, says Fred. Fred says Andy Paul, who I believe was actually Anthony Paul, but he calls him Andy Paul throughout this, was staying in that shed down there at the bottom of the hill by the road. He's a child molester, pedophile, whatever you want to call it. Fred says he went to his friend's house one night and Andy Paul was there, and he had his old lady's oldest daughter there with him at the time, and he never met him before. His friend told him who he was. His friend's truck broke down by the highway, and his friend asked if he could and Andy Paul could go haul his truck in. Before they left to go do that, Andy Paul started busting out lines on the counter, and he said, "Who are all these for?" And Andy Paul said, "They're for everyone." But Fred says nothing was for the oldest daughter because she was a minor. He said Andy Paul was slipping the oldest daughter weed and liquor and stuff. Fred says he knows she wasn't doing pills. Fred says he didn't know he slipped it to her till the next day when Laura wanted Fred to go get liquor for her, and somehow he found out. That's when he, Anthony Paul, moved from down there, says Fred. He says the oldest daughter's name is Destiny. She was 12 or 13 at the time, and she is 20 or 21 now. Fred says it was probably around 2008 or 9. Fred says they moved to Virginia for about 6 months, around 2011. Then they came back, but he went to jail for 3.5 years, then pulled 3.5 probation after that, so about 6 or 7 years. They moved to Virginia till about 2017. Fred says he got out of jail February 21st, 2013. Then Fred says it was 2010 when he moved up there, and it was about 6 months exactly when I went to jail, he says. Ziggy tells Fred he has a really good memory. He says he has to think about it. He says he went to jail around his birthday, I think, because he says 11/11/11 is when something happened, and Ziggy says, I always thought the number 11 was lucky, but I guess not. Ziggy says her lucky number is 333. Fred says his lucky number is 13. Fred says it's going to be crazy when the time change doesn't happen. He says they have done away with it this year. When it falls back in the fall and springs forward, it's not going to do that anymore, Fred says. Someone came to his property one day asking where the Wells property was, and he said it's down the road, and the man asked him something about what he thought happened to Summer, and Fred said he thought she drowned. He says he hardly said anything to the man. Ziggy asks if it was JLR, Jonathan Lee Riches, and Fred says no, he hasn't ever talked to him. Ziggy says JLR said he talked to Fred. Fred says he didn't. Fred says it was probably March when that happened, a couple months after she was there last time in January, which would make it about March. Ziggy said she can't believe more people haven't came down there to talk to him, and she says it's like people are scared. Ziggy said she doesn't get scared easily. Fred says there's nothing to be afraid of. Fred says it's pretty much like this all the time until you leave. Then people steal everything you got. You'd think back here you wouldn't have any trouble with stuff like that, but it's every day, says Fred. Ziggy asks if he thinks Andy Jr., referring to Damian Bernard, was stealing anything around the holler. Fred says he hasn't really seen him off his hill much, but he has seen him in the swimming pool up here with Summer. Just Damian and Summer in the pool together about a month before she went missing, he says. He says he asked where the pool went because they had a big 12-foot across sized pool. He says he didn't even see the boys that day. He just saw Summer and Damian. The dogs are barking. He says they must think someone's messing out there. Ziggy says now she's going to be scared to walk to her car. They were kind of laughing and joking around a little bit. Ziggy asks if Fred has ever heard anything about a peeping Tom. Fred kind of laughs and says, no, I haven't heard anything like that around here. But, he says, hold on, I got to get a drink. He says, I don't know why I thought this part was funny. I've heard Jody Sue I've seen her at the store saying, someone's looking in the windows again, or whatever. I just laugh because I can't help it. I picture Jody Sue in the produce aisle like, oh, someone's going around peeping again, watch out. Anyway, Fred's dog walks up and scares Ziggy. It's a big black dog, it sounds like. It must have been dark out, and the dog must have like snuck up and made some noise and scared her. Ziggy says everybody is suspecting Jody Sue. Fred says Andy came in here and then that truck pulling back out. That was weird to me. He went and checked his other property that day. He hadn't been down there in over a year. That made him go down there to check his what made him go down there to check that property that day? Yeah, what did make him go down there to check that property that day? Because if there wasn't even a road there, then he must not have been down there for a while, or he would have known there wasn't a road there. You know what I'm saying? He would have been like, oh crap, there's not a road here. I can't get up to that property this way anymore. But I don't know. He hadn't been down there in over a year. What made him go there to check it that day? That was weird to me, says Fred. That could be why they were searching the property that day on Fields and Bells Road. That's where his other family property is. He says that's where Andy and Jody lived before they moved up on the hill down here. So that's where TBI was searching, and they didn't know that Andy's family owned any property down there. 4 weeks before they had done a search there, somebody had burned a bunch of stuff right there in the area of where his house would have been. That's interesting. Excuse me. Ziggy says she was looking up that property the other day. Fred says if you didn't know it was there, you would never find it. Just looks like the hillside right there. There's no road up to it anymore. But when you come to Fields off of Beech Creek there, you get to a bridge. And Bells Road is to your left and Fields Road is to your right. There's an old barn and stuff. They're right in the corner. And you keep going on throughout there and you get to a curve. Then you go around the curve on your left and there's a driveway with a big gate around it. If you're looking at the gate with the ridge line there, that's where the gate line runs up. They cut it up. They did away with the roadway. When you're standing at the gate, if you look at the left, that's where the road goes up the ridgeway there. And it's just like walking through the woods. And the TBI knows. They searched it in there. They searched Bells Road and stuff. It comes all the way back. Fred talked to TBI 3 or 4 times. Fred says when Summer first went missing, Jody Sue was talking about the perfect storm and the maroon Tacoma with the ladder rack. And Jody saying, well, what the hell are you going to do when there ain't a ladder rack on it no more? And that stood out to Fred. He says he didn't know till later on that her mom owns a maroon Tacoma, and Jody Sue has been driving it here lately, he says. Ziggy says, yeah, she told me she gave you a ride. The same day her and Andy supposedly went to court over an eviction. Maybe this was the last day he had seen him since he went to Knoxville one time, because he is hard to understand right here. But he says there was a certain day he remembers seeing Andy standing on the hill. He says the last day he saw him, it had been like 21 days he had been in Knoxville. He says he doesn't know what the hell it was about that. He says the third day he was just up and gone. Does anyone know what he says right here and what he is talking about with the third day part? They talked briefly about Jody being the one getting evicted. Maybe Fred was saying the third day after the eviction. Fred talks about Andy's parents' property. John Smith and Polly Bernard, he says. John is his first cousin, John Smith. He said on his mom's side, he has Bernard, and on the Hill side, his dad's side, I'm like second or third cousins with the Crawfords, I believe he says. Fred says John and his wife, they didn't know at the time they were first cousins. He met her way over in Virginia, never met her or nothing before, and nobody told them they were first cousins till it was too late. Ziggy says he thinks they're possibly distant cousins because she was finding connections online. Andy's grandfather on his dad's side was married to another woman when he got a woman pregnant. She says, are you sure his name's Andy Paul? The Andy Paul guy from before, remember? She says, are you sure it's not Anthony Paul? Because I found an Anthony Paul. Fred says, it might be Anthony Paul. He starts talking about him being a registered sex offender. He says that's what Candace and them said. They said they were trying to get rid of him for a long time, says Fred. He says, yes, he is a registered offender and he has been in trouble. Fred says him and Candace were always all over each other. That's great. Yet they said they were trying to get rid of him forever. Fred says he wanted him gone, too, in case he would ever try to do anything against his kids. He goes on to talk a little about Destiny. He says she was 13 at the time. He says she was in a group home, and the group home was taking them to the mall, I believe he said. Andy Paul was there, and he grabbed her and was saying, holler for your daddy now, and stuff to her. Trigger warning, he says the very next night they were doing something there at the mall, and another girl named Ashley ended up getting raped. He says he thinks it was Andy Paul. Fred says Anthony Paul is a few years older than him, about 50. So Andy Paul, Anthony Paul, same person. It's Anthony Paul. Fred starts talking about where Anthony was staying in Virginia, I believe, then starts talking about how close Kingsport is to Virginia when Ziggy asks if it's pretty close. He says from right here to the Virginia line is probably 15 miles, if that. Fred says he had family from Duckfield, Virginia that moved there from Duckfield. Ziggy says she better hurry because it's getting late. They talk about how often Fred goes on YouTube and says every once in a while he will get on there. Ziggy mentions the patchy service. Fred starts talking about what should make the world go round is kids. And that's what people should be talking about. Fred mentions again about how people would leave 10 to 15 kids up there at a time and they would be fine. He says they do anything, those kids. Those kids will just do whatever, apparently. He says he would never do anything to hurt a kid in any way. He says he would give his life any day for a kid. Ziggy tells Fred he doesn't seem like a scary person to her. Fred is very inaudible for a minute with the background noise because there's dogs barking and it's hard to understand. He said he wasn't trying to lead anyone on or set anyone up with the dope thing. He was talking about when he went down and made a statement. He said something about Doug Haskell, I think. He says they asked him about the dope and he didn't set anyone up. He says he didn't even know Jody or Andy and Don and Candace did any drugs besides drinking and smoking pot. He says the first time he saw Don actually have coke was when he came up there trying to get him and his wife Laura to do some coke with him. And that was the day before the boys were taken. So that would have been like a month after Summer went missing. Fred says Don has come there before, high, late at night and stuff. But the day before the boys were taken, he came to his house trying to get him to do coke with him. Fred says Don was acting weird as fuck that night. He thought he was trying to set him up. Fred says he hasn't ever seen him use before, but that he could tell Don was high because he would come up there and ask if he could sit in the driveway and come down from being too high before he goes home so Candace doesn't know. He says Candace was getting Suboxone off of Jody or someone, I believe. He says Jody. He definitely said Jody. And ever since Don went to U-Haul, it seems like everything went to hell from what I took from what he said. Fred says the way Jody Sue Eyes put it, it always seemed like there was a lot of traffic. They talk about how Jody's kids didn't go to school. Fred says he didn't know they had been charged for maintaining a dwelling for illegal activity or whatever. Fred says Jody Sue was saying something about the creek the same day Summer went missing. She didn't say anything about a scream. Jody said nothing about a scream to one of the neighbors in the holler when she seen them. The day that Summer supposedly went missing. The scream that she supposedly heard that was said to be unfounded. Fred says he listens to a little bit of her shit. Fred says Jody was trying to wash off her scent, but she didn't know her scent intensifies in the water, I believe he said. So it stands out to him that Jody was talking about being in the creek on the 15th of June of 2021, the day Summer Moon Utah Wells disappeared. Jody was talking about being in the creek right off the rip, but she wasn't mentioning that scream. Ziggy asks if Jody has a bad reputation around here, and Fred says no. Nobody really mentioned her till Summer went missing. Ziggy mentions that Laura said about Jody having a reputation of being a whore in Beech Creek. I think she actually said a nasty whore. Fred says that's from when she lived in the cloud. apartments and she was stripping. And I know the quality girls they do hire have to be clean. They're strict on their girls. That's where Jody worked, where he is speaking of. He says that means Jody would have to have been clean. Ziggy asks if they ever got pills off Jody. He says no, just drinking and smoking the good pot. Fred says. When he mentioned coke, Don went out that night and spent everything he had. Ziggy says Don said he wants to do coke every time he drinks, which is every night. Ziggy laughs. Candace drinks every night too, says Ziggy. Don said he went dope house to dope house and had a bunch of dope on him, and the TBI was following him. Fred says the TBI was following him. Somehow he knows that. Fred says he doesn't do anything, referring to drugs, I guess. Ziggy says, so you did know that CPS was already in their lives before Summer went missing? Fred says, yeah, a lot of people have called CPS on them in the past. He says a lot of people know that. He says the kids were just bare naked laying on the floor and there wasn't any toys or anything, and he was just trying to talk to Candace and she wouldn't come to the door the day he went down there to move the tree. He says he was mad at her for something. Ziggy points out that Summer had been missing for a year, and now it's been over a year and a half. And that was the whole conversation. And man, my face is tired now from reading all that and staring at the letters for so long. Hi, kitty cat. Hi, wandering hearts. How are you guys? I'll be frank. No. Channel hopping, I like it. I love channel hopping sometimes, just to like spread the love, say what's up. I'm just seeing what you guys were talking about. I didn't have my phone, and it's hard for me because I'll like lose my spot, and I didn't want it to be too broken up because it's already hard enough to understand. Hey, what's up, Imagine Peace? How are you doing? But yeah, so I never know what to talk about when I get done with one of these because I always want to keep it like, like a certain video. Like I made a video and I worked hard to type it all out and I wanted it to just be all one thing and I didn't want to get all off topic and everything. But I think it's okay if I start doing that a little bit here and there because why not? If people want to stop listening when I say it's over and then or if they want to keep listening after I say it's over, that's their choice, I guess. You can always tap out whenever. But, yeah. Yeah, Wandering Hearts. But, yeah, anyways, I was just wanting to say hi to everybody. And I'm going to go, just to keep it what it was, keep it simple. But all right, thanks for being here, you guys. I appreciate it. And I hope you all have a good night. Bye.